Okay, we're in Proverbs 18. Let's continue to take a look at the wisdom of Solomon, and there's a few different verses in here we'll talk about during the discussion time. Verse 1 says this: "An unfriendly person pursues selfish ends, and against all sound judgment starts quarrels. Fools find no pleasure in understanding, but delight in airing their own opinions." Given the fact that we live in a day and age of everybody being able to give their opinion, and social media is a big one, obviously, for that one, is it's hard for us, even ourselves, because when you live in a culture where, everybody has an opinion, everybody's able to voice their opinion, in let's say American culture 50 years ago or 80 years ago or such, is if people gave their opinions, they were in usually a small town or a city or something. They had a small group of people that they could influence around them. And so if it was a good idea, there was enough people around them that were in relationship to them to be able to say, oh, that's a good idea. It was a bad idea. There was also enough people around him who told him it was a stupid idea, and they ought to move on. And nowadays, you really have this option for every idea can be seen as a good idea, because there's enough, and to be honest, one of the things that Proverbs teaches is there's enough fools who have gotten together on social media. Now, the flip side is you recognize also that on social media there also can be very good ideas that find a landing point and a lot of people that can support it or something like that. But the problem is there's also a lot of bad ideas that find support as well. Two questions that I think of when it comes to this verse is the idea of the fool delights in airing their own opinions. The question really becomes, when we're thinking about what our opinion is, two questions I wrote down here is, how does what I say measure up to God's word? And so you can have your own opinion, but if it's going to measure up to the truth of God's word, or it's not going to measure up. Now, the challenge is, if a person denies God's word, then they can have their opinion, and their opinion is their opinion. There's nobody really who can say your opinion is wrong. It has to be measured against something. And so one of the questions you have to ask is, how does what I say measure up to God's word? And then, how do I speak what is God's truth and not just my own opinion? Because all of us, whether we want to admit it or not, all of us are opinionated about different things. And that arises from all different sources: our family background, our cultural background, the things that we learn over the course of our lives, maybe things we've been hurt by that we have a reaction against, maybe things that have been pleasurable experiences that we have a reaction for. So there's all these things that work together to make our opinion. But the opinion still has to be measured against God's truth. Verse 3, "When wickedness comes, so does contempt, and with shame comes reproach. The words of the mouth are deep waters, and the fountain of wisdom is a rushing stream. It is not good to be partial to the wicked, and so deprive the innocent of justice. The lips of fools bring them strife, and their mouths invite a beating. The mouth of fools are their undoing, and their lips are a snare to their very lives. The words of a gossip are like choice morsels, they go down to the inmost parts. One who is slack in his work is brother to one who destroys." We've talked about that issue of the foolish person who decides don't have to work, don't have to strive to do my best, things of that nature. And we'll talk about that one later in the discussion more, because the interesting thing here is it compares the slackard, it compares the person who chooses not to work with actually the person who destroys. And the question becomes is why does it compare those two? It seems like one is worse than the other, that the person who destroys is worse than the slackard. But I actually think that there's a reason why they say that they're basically brothers. Because basically it's saying that there's a sort of equality between sloth and destruction. Which when you first look at it, you think, well, that's kind of strong wording. That a slothful or a slackard would also be a destroyer. So we'll discuss that one later, because I'll talk about and we'll discuss why that's true, that a slackard is as bad as someone who destroys. Verse 10, very famous verse. The name of the Lord is a fortified tower. Oftentimes you hear the name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run into it and are safe. Was turned into a song a number of years ago also. Verse 11, the wealth of the rich is their fortified city. They imagine it a wall too high to scale. Before a downfall, the heart is haughty, but humility comes before honor. To answer before listening, that is folly and shame. The human spirit can endure in sickness, but a crushed spirit who can bear? We'll talk about that one a little bit in the discussion time. The heart of the discerning acquires knowledge, for the ears of the wise seek it out. A gift opens the way and ushers the giver into the presence of the great. In a lawsuit, the first to speak seems right until someone comes forward and cross-examines. So it's a really interesting phrase, and one of the things that I have found interesting and very true is a person who has been wronged, and like they've spent a period of time frustrated, emotional because they've been wrong, potentially seething with anger because they're wrong, and all the different emotions that go into being wronged. Is if you sit down with them and you listen to them, this really is true, that they will, I'm going to use the word twist, they'll twist the truth in their favor to make you feel that they're the one that is in that the other person that has wronged them is the wrong one, not them. And I'll give you an example of this one time. One of the churches I pastored had a lawsuit between two of the leaders in the church. And it eventually destroyed a lot of things. It was very destructive. But I remember somebody coming to me because they had sat down at lunch or breakfast or something with the person that had brought the lawsuit because they felt they had been wronged. And so they described to me the whole scenario of how bad they felt for this person because they had been wronged, and even came to the point of saying, well, so-and-so sued so-and-so, and it was actually the opposite. So the way the person had presented themselves to this person, they literally thought that the other person had brought the lawsuit. Because that person twisted it so much in their favor, and this person felt so sorry for them because he sat there and listened to this person, poor old me, that's had to go through this kind of stuff. And they listened to it for so long that they actually just had the facts totally wrong. And this wasn't a person that was not intelligent. This was actually a very intelligent person. But because of the way the person had presented it, they thought everything was on their side. Mm-hmm. And then when I said, it's not exactly happened that way, they were very surprised. I laid out a couple things. They were like, wow, I didn't take from that at all. Mm-hmm. And so I do believe that, and of course that was in a lawsuit situation. And I don't think it's just like verse 17, I don't think it just maybe applies to a lawsuit, although it would. I think it's in general when we feel we have been hurt, whether we've been hurt or not, it's very easy for us in our sin nature twist things to make all the fault lay with the other person. It's very difficult for us to see that maybe there's a portion of us that's at fault. You see that in marriage counseling a lot. When couples are not doing well in marriage counseling, they tend to adopt this kind of attitude of it's always the other person's fault. And I always say it takes two to tango, and that's just the way human relationships work. And it's not that one person can't be terribly abusive and the other person is trying to be as godly as possible. That can happen. But in many, many relationships, what you see is when things are not going right, one of the challenges is to help a person not to feel like they need to, what's the term, to destroy somebody's reputation. And that's kind of what happens in a lawsuit with the first person to speak, is they speak, everything about what they're saying, Solomon says, is right, but wait till the cross-examination and you find that that may not be true. Verse 18, casting the lot settles disputes and keeps strong opponents apart, which brings to bear the question of why do we not cast lots any longer? Because that's just not something that we tend to do. A brother wronged, and here going back to verse 17, what we said about 17, here's another verse that talks about this idea. A brother wronged is more unyielding than a fortified city. Disputes are like the barred gates of a citadel. And even in the church, I have seen a person who is wronged, and that verse is extremely true about what people can do when they don't forgive, don't process the wrong properly, even if they have been wronged, is they end up building basically a wall between not just the person who has wronged them, but potentially anybody else that has a relationship with that person either as well. Verse 20, from the fruit of their mouth a person's stomach is filled. With the harvest of their lips they are satisfied. The tongue has the power of life and death, and those who love it will eat its fruit. He who finds a wife finds what is good and receives favor from the Lord. Amen. There you go. The poor pleaded for mercy, but the rich answer harshly. One who has unreliable friends soon comes to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother, which does lead to the question is, wait a second, if they're unreliable, how much of a friend are they really?
That's true.
All right, let's take a break, and then we're going to discuss a few of these verses.
We're back in about a minute.
Okay, so let's focus on a few different verses. We talked briefly about this one, verse 9. One who is slack in his work is brother to one who destroys. And, you could argue there it not necessarily is saying that the two are the same, but they're definitely connected when it talks about them being brothers. So the slacker is closely related to the one who destroys. And so what I would ask is, why would Solomon think it wise to compare the slackard with the destroyer?
I think it has to do with what we're seeing right now as far as socialism is concerned. If everybody's going to get the same, the slackards say, well, why should I do anything? And it destroys the person who is the worker, the one that wants to do the work. He says, well, why should I if he's going to get the same thing I'm going to get? So I think it's just a common thing of bringing everybody down.
Yep. Yeah, and it kind of says that potentially the slackard is going to impact things in
Right.
some way, shape, or form that's going to cause destruction in the long run.
Like a bad apple in the basket.
Yes, yeah, after a while it starts to rot away
Spreads,
everything.
yeah.
Yeah. So that's one thing. Other thoughts
Yeah.
about that?
Well, we were discussing that today regarding Spain opening their borders, and now it's causing a horrible situation for the people who have been there and have done the right thing, and now these people are coming in and eating and sleeping and not doing anything.
Yeah, and one of the challenges with, and this is a whole big issue obviously, but one of the challenges with unrestrained immigration is, what do you do with that number of people? And the question becomes is, what do they bring to the table? Because people can come in through immigration and can bring something to the table. They can be everything from a hard laborer to a doctor, to all sorts of different professions. The difficulty is when you have immigration and you have people who come in and there's either no jobs for them, or they don't feel like they need to work because the government's going to provide for them, that's a slackard mentality that eventually will be destructive. The other thing, and I looked at this from a cultural standpoint of, so in that day and age, and then bring it all the way forward. So let me share a few things with you about this. In an agrarian society, which was what Solomon was in that time period, it's where farming is the main source of sustenance, basically, as an agrarian society. What happens with the slackard? The slackard doesn't produce. And the reason is because you think about what the farmer has to do at the beginning of the season. He has a time period where he has to get everything planted. Then he has a time period, and there's wiggle room. It's not like it's an exact, but there's definitely a time period where if the person doesn't work hard, you're not getting everything planted in time. Mm-hmm. And then later on in the fall, if you don't work hard, all of us have, I shouldn't say all of us. I can remember, getting hired by the local farmer to throw hay on the wagon because there's a certain time period. Mm-hmm. I remember talking to a whole bunch of people over the years that live in Indiana, and they have this thing in Indiana called tasseling. Have you ever heard that? Mm-hmm. Where they hire these busloads of teenagers for like a 2-week period. And they take these teenagers out in the middle of no place, and they have to detassel the corn. They just go through and they have to pull something. They have to walk through all the cornfields, and all day long, all they're doing is pulling this off. And for some of them, it's their only summer job, it's their only extra income, and they work like 12 hours a day for like 2 weeks, because that's the time period you have to get it done in. And so the slackard in an agrarian society will destroy everything because the time periods are so important. So let's, think about in a merchant culture, what happens to the slackard over time in a merchant culture? Well, all of us see it at times where we go into businesses and we see that the employees are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're slacking off. And what happens when you see that over time? You stop going, and then they stop going, and then you stop going, and then we stop going, and the business fails. Mm-hmm. And so in a merchant situation, the slackard will destroy you get enough slackards, they'll destroy a business. In a science and technology culture that we live in today, so to not discover in a timely fashion, we all know how fast technology develops. Imagine if the people who are developing technology and science were slackards. What's going to happen to them? everybody else around them is miles ahead of them in discovery of new technology, of new science. And the slacker just basically, we don't see it, but they just disappear. They're not going to make it in that kind of environment where every day there seems to be a new discovery. So there's all these different businesses and all these different cultures where the slackard will just destroy things in a very short period of time. So that's why I think I agree with that verse wholeheartedly, is the slackard and the destroyer is very closely related. And
we have that. I mean, we've just been through that period right now with the cherry harvest. I mean, it's going to be now and then, or if you don't do it, forget it, because they're no good.
Yeah. And there's no farmer that would think slacking is a good idea.
That's right. I mean, you got a short period of time, you either do it or don't bother.
Make hay while the sun's shining.
Well, and that's why we have so many phrases like that, because it's an incredibly important thing. So the verse 14, let's go up to that one. The human spirit can endure in sickness, but a crushed spirit who can bear? So it's an interesting phrase because it questions whether we can even basically survive when somebody has a crushed spirit. The Hebrew word there has been translated as crushed, broken, smitten. There was actually a medical report recently that I saw where I think it's in the last chapter. We didn't talk about this one, but it talks about how the crushed spirit, their very bones dry up. And there's actually some truth to that. That the person with severe psychological pain, we all know that it impacts the body in a variety of ways, and there's actually some suggestion that it actually impacts the bones over time. So the idea of the verse, I think it's in chapter 17, where it talks about a crushed spirit dries up the bones, is the word they use, where that's not maybe just metaphorical, it may actually be actual. What's your thought about that? Is a crushed spirit who can bear? There's a suggestion here that the outside events that happen in our lives can cause some pretty severe damage to our lives.
I mean, you think of everything from the instances you hear of, whether it be a plane crash, shipwreck, whatever, and people are in these extreme situations, or of like back in World War II, Korean War, the prisoners of war that were kept in these really isolated situations where they if there's a hope, then there's a survival. But when a crushed spirit, the loss of hope, the loss of, I'm going to get out of here, I'm going to make it to wherever, somebody's going to rescue me, where all hope is gone, then they give up. And it's like, that's kind of what I've taken from that.
So it's interesting. I was trying to remember, and I think it's also Viktor Frankl that came up with another version of this. The one that I pulled up is actually by Nietzsche, so he may have been the first to put it this way. But the quote is, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." And the Frankl quote is something along the lines of, along that line, as long as there is hope, a person can put up with almost anything. But there has to be that hope.
Right.
And that's the challenge, is some people who give up, they give up because they think there's no hope for them.
Right.
Yeah. Last one we'll talk about, verse 19. A brother wronged is more unyielding than a fortified city. Disputes are like the barred gates of a citadel. And that kind of goes back to the other verse that we were talking about, that I gave that example of the person who is in a lawsuit, that kind of has their take on things until they're cross-examined. But this idea of a brother who is wronged, why is it so hard for people to let go of a wrong?
I think many people, they want, especially when it involves them, they want justice. They want the offense towards them to be, sort of like what we discussed last week in chapter 17, where, we want to see, whether it be in a real life situation or in a movie, you want the villain
Mm-hmm.
to get their just dessert, so to speak, and so it's amazing that in this day and age, in our litigious society, that just to the lengths of even someone who is guilty of something, that they'll go to prove their innocence.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think too, it says an offended brother is more unyielding than a fortified city. It's like, when I read that, brother, it suggests someone close to him has offended.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean? And so I think too, when it's someone close to you, you weren't expecting that. And I think it cuts deeper when it's, someone you trusted or was a friend or a relative. It just goes deeper, I think.
Well, I think it's just human nature that if you're accused of something, you want to prove that you are right, and your mind starts running down the road, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
picking up all these things that this is why I am right,
Right.
and you don't stop and think about why you might be wrong.
Right.
You're so busy accumulating the things to prove that your point that
Yeah. And you're also accumulating all the reasons that the other person is wrong.
Exactly,
Yeah. And it really does become a cycle in your life, and this is where it's unfortunate, because there's people who carry those kind of weights for 6 days, 6 months, 6 years, 66 years. I mean, it's just something that they cannot let go. And I've watched people who have couple scenarios I've been a part of where you touch that nerve and you'll see 30 years worth of I'm right and they're wrong, or 30 years worth of, oh, what an injustice I was served 30 years ago, and how powerful that event is in their life 30 years later. And how much it impacted their spirit over time. And that's where we really have to, and again, like you say, you use the term human nature, Don, sin nature. It's we want what we want to be right, and we want the other to be wrong when we've been offended, and letting go of that is incredibly difficult, and it's also the reason for the cross. Is because all have sinned. We've all blown it. We all deserve punishment. We could easily think about not just about how we've been wronged, but if we turn it around, we could start talking over and over again about how much we've wronged God by our sin, by our brokenness, by all of the unforgiveness that we carry, things of that nature. And God said there's a better way. And we have to be able to bring those things to the foot of the cross and lay them down and say, don't need vengeance. Even if I don't get justice in this life, justice will come, eventually. And I can lay this down, and I can forgive, and I can move on. And what's the quote that you often say, Debbie, as far as the jail cell?
So they're held captive in a cage of unforgiveness.
Yeah.
And they're the ones in that cage.
Yeah. And
Not the person who hurt
they've
them.
locked themselves in that cage of unforgiveness. And all of us,
And they don't realize it.
Yeah, all of us have the potential to do it, you know, and the interesting thing about it is one of the things I've noticed in my own spiritual walk is I can have forgiven over a period of time, and if I'm not careful, I can bring up that wrong again that happened, and I usually refer to it as swimming in the sea of forgetfulness, is that we go back, God's forgiven that, either our sin or somebody else's sin against us, God's forgiven it, but we'll pick it back up again.
I used to work with a guy, and he at one time came right out and said, although he didn't say forgive, but he says, well, I'll never forget
Mm-hmm.
what somebody did to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, well, what's the difference between forgiving and forgetting? You might as well get over it and forget and go on.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing of what they mean by that, because so for instance, on one side, this is what I would say is, when a terrible thing happens to you in your life, you're never going to forget it.
Right.
I mean, it's just like when a great thing happens in your life, you're never going to forget it. But the issue becomes is, what does he mean by that? Because oftentimes we really say, well, I'll never forget it, and what we mean is, we'll never forgive the person. Yeah, I mean, that's really what we're saying. And so, you know, yeah, I mean, you can say, well, I won't forget this, you know, and the truth is, yeah, it's terrible. How can you ever, you know, it's locked into your psyche. You will always remember it. But the issue is you can forgive and move on. And there's, people use the term forget, but they actually mean the term not forgive.
Well, I think too, it's like you don't have to dwell on it and live there.
Yeah.
You know, it happened, and yeah, you're not going to forget it. You might forget parts of it, and I think sometimes you remember enough to keep yourself safe next time, you know, to not get in that situation. But it's like, you don't have to live there. It doesn't have to define you. And I think some people, it defines them.
There's a really interesting story in a book by Philip Yancey called What's So Amazing About Grace. And he talks about a family that has basically, because the mother chose not to forgive, it traces 2 more generations after that of what happened to the children and the grandchildren as a result of the mother choosing not to forgive, because her whole life was not spiritually satisfying because she couldn't forgive. You know, and so she passed that unsatisfaction in her spiritual life down to her children and her grandchildren, and they were recipients of, rather than a blessing, they were recipients of a curse. He doesn't put it that way, but that's basically what I believe it is if you don't forgive, you have the potential to curse future generations in regards to their spiritual walk, because they're gonna grow up watching you as an unforgiving person. And that's definitely going to impact their spiritual walk in some way, shape, or form. Now, they may get over that by their own spiritual walk flourishing, but they may also be impacted very severely. I think there's probably a number of people who don't attend church because of how Grandma and Grandpa talked about church, or how Mom and Dad talked about church, and how negative they were toward it, that maybe they got hurt and stopped attending, and then the children find out, and then, you know, it's like, we don't do that. And so they pass unforgiveness, people who are wronged, and basically become unyielding like a fortified city or the barred gates of a citadel. It'll impact the people in the city and in the citadel, and that's the family especially. So that is Proverbs chapter 18. Some beautiful, beautiful truth in there. And we will finish up today, and then we will jump next week into chapter 19. Yes, you guessed it right. Have a wonderful evening.